It's been 4 years since the repeal of the government's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly in the military. But there's still a ban on service by transgender people. It is based on military medical regulations put in place before the American Psychiatric Association declared in 2013 that being transgender is not in itself a mental disorder. Dr. Jon LaPook tells us the story of Landon Wilson, who was kicked out of the military because he is transgender.
It was a command sergeant major in Afghanistan who pulled me to his office, and he said, "I need to know exactly what you are."
What Landon Wilson was transgender. In his case, born biologically a female, but living as a male. His commanding officer uncovered his secret at the end of 2013 while reviewing then 23-year-old Wilson for a promotion. He was forced to leave the military with an honorable discharge.
What went through your head as you were packing up your gear to leave?
My main concern was who was going to take my spot. When you're in a place like that, you can't really afford to lose anybody.
You were worried about your buddies, about the mission.
Absolutely.
Wilson had enlisted as a female, then decided to transition. That meant beginning to live and express himself as the gender he identified with. He took male hormones, and by the time he was deployed to a new unit with military intelligence in Afghanistan, he looked and sounded masculine and was placed in a male barracks.
What was that like?
It was the best experience of my entire military career. It was probably the only time that I knew 100% that I could focus on my job without worrying about my gender coming into play.
Mara Kiesling, who transitioned 15 years ago, is the executive director of the National Center for Transgender Equality.
Transgender people are people whose gender identity, that is their internal sense of their gender, just doesn't line up with what the doctor told our parents when we were born. Is it a boy or a girl?
From the age of 3 or 4, Wilson felt his gender was male.
I remember announcing proudly to my mom that this whole girl thing just wasn't cut out for me. And I recognized then that the reaction I got wasn't probably the best.
You somehow got the message this was not something anybody wanted to hear about.
It was just, this is how things are and this is how they're going to be.
A 2011 survey by the National Center for Transgender Equality found 41% of transgender people had attempted suicide. The decision to transition can bring a sense of peace.
There's a relief in saying, you know what, this is who I am. There's a relief in saying, this is what I'm going to do.
Transitioning may or may not involve hormones or surgery.
Can you explain to people why whether you have the operation or not is really irrelevant to you?
It doesn't change who you are as a person. How we see ourselves and how we present ourselves to the world is much more important than the underlying layers of what's under our clothes or what could be under our clothes. Gender is completely independent of your sex.
And Dr. LaPook joins us now. Jon, let me just start off by asking you, for a lot of people, this is so confusing, the idea that biological sex can be different from gender. Could you just break that down for us?
Right. So, it was even tough for me to understand back in 2009 when Chaz Bono announced that he's a transgender male. I realized I knew nothing about this, and I ended up calling Mara Kiesling, who's the head of the National Committee for Transgender Equality, and said, look, I'm one of those doctors who doesn't know anything real. I wasn't taught anything in medical school about this, maybe this much. So she explained to me that, and there's lots of ways, you try to be politically correct in how you say this, but basically simply, your biological sex, what the doctor told your parents your sex was, male or female, when you were born, what you are from the waist down, usually aligns with what your sense of gender identity is from the neck up. But it doesn't always align, and when it doesn't align, it's really terrible. It's really difficult for those people. They know from the age of 3, 4, or 5 that something's just wrong, that something's not resonating for them. And, of course, there's a lot of societal shame, there's a lot of discrimination, and a lot of people just sort of keep it to themselves because they hear from their parents when they sort of bring it up, this is not something anybody wants to discuss. The suicide rate, according to a 2011 survey, is 41%. The suicide attempt rate, not the suicide attempt rate. So 41%. In the general population, it's more like 1.6%. So it's way, way out there.
So given all of that and the confusion that exists, how do you go about treating someone psychologically, physically?
I think it's very difficult. And, there's this great program out right now called Transparent. Jill Soloway's the creator. It's on Amazon, and she actually has a parent who was born biologically male, who then transitioned to being female. And that is exactly the journey that's happening in that. And you see the reaction of the family, the reaction of the friends, of colleagues. It's very, very difficult. So you have all of these struggles growing up, keeping it to yourself. When you do decide to transition, there's a whole new set of obstacles. And I should say the word transitioning is very difficult. I didn't really understand it. I asked Mara Kiesling, what's the question that sort of gets you? And it's sort of, I said, most incorrect question or something like that. I used a different word.
Right.
But she said, well, it's because people ask, when was the operation? Tell me about the operation. Transitioning may or may not involve hormones or an operation. It may be simply in your own mind, you're saying, this is my gender. I am now saying this is my gender. It may be just changing your sex on your license plate. Or it may involve a continuum that goes all the way up to doing hormones and surgery.
So if you have all these questions as an educated doctor, I can't imagine for the general public, how does the lack of awareness about transgender issues kind of manifest themselves?
Well, I think it's huge. First of all, there's a lot of violence against people who are transgender. And Mara Kiesling said it's actually increasing. Now, maybe it's increasing because more and more people, as she said, are sort of coming out of the woodwork, and they're more obvious, and then there's more violence against them. They tend to end up homeless more often. There's discrimination in health care, all sorts of things like that. And doctors themselves often don't know how to take care of people. So, it's a really big deal, and that's why we're doing this piece for the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley, because we really need to shine a light on this. There's so much miscommunication. We need to have a national conversation, but you can't have a conversation unless you know the words. You need the vocabulary. What does transitioning mean? What does transgender mean? And it's tough.
Yeah.
I found myself struggling for being correct in exactly the words I was using, but I think it's something we have to, with practice, we will get there. And of course, the discrimination comes from lack of understanding. If we get a little understanding in there, then maybe things will be better.
Yeah, that's a startling statistic that you mentioned. 41% attempted suicide.
Attempted suicide,
wow.
A big deal. And it varies a little different from study to study, but the biggest one said 41%, and of course depression's a huge problem. So hopefully by shining light on this and by having a national conversation, we will make things better for people who aren't exactly like us if we happen not to be a transgender person.
All right, an important issue. Dr. Jon LaPook, thank you so much.
Thank you.